Tonight we're going to turn to Titus chapter 1 and we'll be looking at verses 5 through 9. Now, we probably won't even get through what I've got here tonight, but we're going to try. And I've called it the conduct expressed. And the Apostle Paul gives his instructions to Titus concerning the qualification for pastors or elders that Titus was to appoint to these leadership positions in the church. Now, I know we have discussed these qualifications in the book of Timothy, but nonetheless, they're important because I believe there are men who do not meet the high standards or expectations that are required by Scripture to be pastors of a church. In many respects today, it's a matter of convenience. Churches need pastors, they want pastors, and so they are eager to get someone to fill that position. And they have the tendency to overlook and only choose from some of the qualifications that are listed here. Not all of them that are listed. So they pick and choose because it becomes a convenience. We need to have a pastor in our church, and well, he might be a bit short on this and this and this, but we'll take him anyway. But the duty and responsibility of a pastor is, first of all, he's called to represent God. And as such, he should be suitably qualified and be able to meet and maintain the high standards that God sets forth for this position. And it's important that the church gets it right in appointing a pastor to shepherd them in the things of God, both in word and in deed. Because it's a tragedy when a church gets it wrong. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, both in the present and in the future, when the church gets the wrong man in that position as pastor. And really, we shouldn't seek to change or to lower God's standards for pastors simply for convenience. So we're going to revisit these requirements for a pastor as defined in the Word of God. They're not by me, but they are concerned by the Apostle Paul. And the first thing that Paul does for Titus is this, is the charge explained. I left you in Crete so you could finish doing the things that still needed to be done, so you could appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Now, it's a twofold requirement that Titus is given here. And the first one, I believe, is the completion. I've left you in Crete so you could finish doing the things that still needed to be done. And here, Paul is very concerned about the culture and the morality of believers in Crete. And why? Because if you lived on Crete, you were known for your immorality. You were known far and wide. And this was something he wanted to correct. It's something that he wanted the believers in Crete to have a positive foundation if they were going to live godly lives in an immoral society. Now, the influence of a pagan society can never be underestimated. And Paul didn't want the churches, he didn't want believers to assimilate negative influence of paganism into the Christian life, which is something that's easy to do. You live for the Lord on Sunday, but the rest of the week you add a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this, and you assimilate it into your life. And Paul wants him to understand it's more than just saying, hey, look, I'm a Christian. They had to live it out. Walk the walk and talk the talk. Be consistent. And it was to this point in time that Paul sent Titus to straighten out the churches in Crete. He was a troubleshooter, someone who went in and sorted out problems that the church was experiencing. And Paul uses the word to set in order, to make things straight. And he uses a word from which we get our word orthodontics. Now, what's orthodontics? If you go to an orthodontist, what does he do? If you've got foot problems, oh, that's a podiatrist, but if you've got problems with your teeth, if you've got problems with your feet, you go to these specialists and they straighten them out. They sort them out. And that's the idea of what it is, to straighten, to make straight. Something which was crooked, something which doesn't function as it should, it means to straighten out so they can function. And Paul is saying to Titus, look, Titus, you go to Crete, you fully straighten out those things which need to be corrected, you make them straight so they can function as they're supposed to. And it seems from our text, this is something that Paul had started but never completed. And I want us to remember, Paul didn't start the churches in Crete. Somebody else had done that. So Titus' task was to make sure they were growing and developing in their witness in the community in which they lived. That was his job. Now, I have no doubts there's a number of issues. When you start a church or a church is starting to develop, issues arrive. And if you haven't got good leadership, then things can go astray very quickly. And I would have thought there was probably many issues that need to be dealt with, issues that needed to be confronted, sins that needed to be dealt with, leaders who were anything but godly. I have no doubts there were theological issues that needed to be corrected, and appointing godly leaders to shepherd the church where the people knew who was in charge, where the people knew in which direction they were to go. That's a big task to ask a troubleshooter to come in and fix. It really is. I have no doubts there would have been construction and maintenance with things that needed constant attention. And so Paul is saying, Titus, I'm sending you to get the churches on the same page. I want you to organise them in a proper way. I want you to put the right people in the right positions. I want everybody on the same page so they can move forward together in unity and as one. So Paul's priority here is to make sure the churches in Crete had every opportunity to get things right in order to have a good and effective witness in the community. And to do that, you've got to build the right foundation. You've got to get the basics right. Here is where Titus enters in. He comes into the churches. They're already functioning. And he's supposed to institute changes and get people to accept them as being necessary if they wanted to survive. So that is the first thing. Not an easy task. Complete the things that we've started. Correct things that need to be done. And then I've called the next one the certification. And so you could appoint elders in every town as I directed you. So the second part of Titus's charge is to appoint elders or pastors in all the churches that seem to be scattered throughout Crete. So this is a conviction that Paul had. This is to be a priority, Titus. Make sure the right leaders are in position. This would have been something Paul would have done from the beginning if he'd set the churches up. Now, he's concerned that because they didn't have the right foundation, things could go horribly wrong. So Titus was to step in, get things right, avoid chaos and confusion that would need a great deal of reckoning later on. So they've got to have a firm foundation. And it's important. For any church to survive, you've got to have good leadership, because churches need that leadership to survive the environments in which they live, to face any future difficulties they would encounter. It required men who were biblically qualified to lead the people, and that's important. The word for elder was presbyteros, and in those days it simply meant an older man. That's what it meant. an older man. Then it came to mean the official office of a person who was the pastor or overseer. That's what it developed into. Titus, you appoint suitable men to fill these positions according to the biblical mandate that's here, and also in 1 Timothy 3. Those qualifications are set forth. Paul says, I've directed you. It means this is something we've discussed. And Paul is saying, look, you and I have talked about these things, Titus. Now I'm going to put them into print so that everybody is clear about what you're doing and why. And I do this for the very reason, Titus, so that I want the churches to know these things so they have no reason to oppose you or to resist you, but will cooperate with you in these matters. So Paul has set forth the criteria, if you like, and that's what we're examining in these next verses. The criteria examined. And once again, I say to you, this is based upon biblical standards. An elder must not be guilty of doing wrong, must have only one wife, must have believing children. They must not be known as children who are wild and do not cooperate. As God's managers, overseers must not be guilty of doing wrong, being selfish or becoming angry quickly. They must not drink too much wine, like to fight, or try to get rich by cheating others. Overseers must be ready to welcome guests, love what is good, be wise, live right, be holy and self-controlled. By holding on to the trustworthy word, just as we teach it, overseers can help people by using true teaching, and they can show those who are against the true teaching that they're wrong. Nothing wrong with that, is there? Pretty straightforward? You would think so, but it wasn't. Now, would we say that's a pretty straightforward criteria for pastors today? Yes or no? It should be. But as I've said, because of a matter of convenience, churches pick and choose the qualities that they want in a pastor. And as a result, they shortchange themselves because the Bible has set specific expectations and standards that are required of those who fill these positions. And we're going to examine them. The first is the character. An elder must not be guilty of doing wrong. I wonder how many elders or how many pastors that rules out. Does it mean he has to be sinlessly perfect? Well, there's no way that a pastor can be sinlessly perfect because he still is human. He is not perfect. But we need to have a look at what this means. He must not be guilty of doing wrong, or, as many other translations would put it, he has to be above reproach, is the term that is used in many different translations. Now, what does that mean, and what does it look like in real life that a pastor is to be above reproach? In the original, it means to be without fault and without accusation. That's the meaning in the original. Without fault, without accusation. And it's saying that a man who wants to be a pastor must live his life in such a way that when people look at it, when people examine it, when they look at what he does, they find no fault with him. They can't make accusations because he's consistent with the word that he brings and the life that he lives. People cannot call him out for being a hypocrite. In other words, he says one thing and does the opposite. If he's taken before a court of law and examined, the idea is they'll find nothing to convict him of. That's the idea here. There's nothing in his present life, There's nothing from his past life that they can take and use against him. His life is consistent with what he preaches. People are not gossiping about him. They're not talking about indiscretions for all the wrong reasons. A pastor is someone who lives an exemplary life in his walk with the Lord and the people he serves. So the character of a pastor must be that is beyond reproach. In other words, people look at his life, they can't find anything. His message and his walk and his everything are consistent with who he is. They can't throw mud. They can't find anything to dig up and say, well, you know what, your pastor is this and he does this and he does this. When they examine it, they find there's nothing. And so the character is he must be exemplary in the life that he lives. The second one, the control. He must have only one wife, must have believing children, and they must not be known as children who are wild and do not cooperate. That's in a modern translation, but I think it stems it and says it pretty clearly. And what it's teaching here, in the very first part, he must have only one wife. What would you think if I had 6 wives? Just asking. I'm content with one. But it says he must be the husband of one wife. In other words, our text makes it plain that the pastor is to be a one-woman man, meaning that he's devoted to the woman who is his wife. Now, why is that important? Why is that important? And it's important that we understand the background from which this is coming. In ancient times, false prophets, false religion, and sexual freedom were practiced with complete freedom with temple prostitutes. And it seems that the society tolerated and accepted these practices. And Paul is saying to Titus, you find me men who have an impeccable reputation. You find me men who do not indulge themselves in these practices. Find men who are above reproach. Find men who are loyal to the woman who is their wife, so that no one can point the finger at him and say, you hypocrite. We know as a community that you're having it off with other women while you're still married. Now, right away, in today's society, that would cancel a lot of pastors who are in the pulpit, because they've been known to have affairs with people in their own congregations, and they're still the pastor of the church. So they failed to meet the qualifications here of being devoted to one wife. And Paul says you cannot have this type of man as a pastor. He's not qualified to speak on God's behalf because he cannot live it out in his personal life. He cannot say with confidence, this is God's ideal plan for life. One man, one woman for life, because he's failed to put it into practice himself. So he's not a good example of living it out before his congregation. Now, in our modern churches today, men who are not qualified to speak about marriage and family are in those pulpits because they failed to model it in their own lives. Now, how would it go if, as your pastor, how would you look at things if I'm teaching you about the sacredness of marriage, teaching you about how to be faithful to your wife and raise your kids in a godly way, and you knew I was having an affair with someone in the church? what would you say? You would probably leave the church. You would say, you hypocrite, why should I listen to you when you can't do it yourself? That means I've lost my reputation. I have stained the church's reputation. And most of all, it means I'm no longer fit to be a pastor. That's what it means. I have disqualified myself from that position. So the expectations and standards are high for those who represent God. And the issue here is more about the moral character of the man who is a pastor than his marital status. Paul says, you find me men in life who are above reproach in the eyes of everybody regarding their marital situation. That means one woman, one wife for life, and who's totally loyal to her. You find me one. So even in those days in Crete, it was hard to find a good man who was doing the right thing. He must have a reputation of being sexually pure, devoted to his one wife, not being scandalized by past mistresses or illegal children or present adulteries. Now, having said that, I'm probably going to tread on some people's toes here, because I personally think that if a man has been divorced, then he cannot be a pastor either. He's disqualified himself because he's failed to live it out for whatever reasons. He's disqualified himself from that position. And I know, hey, look, we can be forgiven. There's no question about that. But you cannot restore that man to the same position of trust that he once held. Now, I know there are many who will disagree with me, but I'll stand by my convictions upon what the Bible says. He can serve in other positions, but being a pastor then, it's off the table for him. It's not an option for him to consider. And the reason is simple. God's standards are high for anyone who holds that office. It's not something to be taken lightly. As one commentator says, the task of building strong marriages, godly marriages, necessitates the most impeccable marriage history in his own life. And the need for confronting sin demanded the cleanest history in his own marriage. And having one who has never been divorced but has singularly been married to the same woman would be the kind of premium example that God would want. The intent of this is a man who is a model of God's design. One man, one woman together for life. He's to model that before the people that he ministers to. Now that's something for us to chew on. It's not something that's palatable in a modern day society. And that's what I mean. Churches pick and choose. They desperately want a man of God to lead them, but they'll just disregard some of these qualifications that are important. Then he moves on to the question of family leadership. Wow. The qualification for a man who wants to be a pastor is that his family life is to be founded on godliness and faithfulness. It's not to be built on rebellion and children living the opposite life to that of their father. That's important. Our text says having children who believe. Children who are not accused of rebellion and wild living, doing their own thing in opposition to godliness in the family home. And Paul says, if you want to see if a man is qualified, take a look at his family. Look at those who see him in all circumstances. Look at how they respond to his leadership, because they're the people who know him best. Now, if a man is to be considered for leadership in the church, then that man must have proven himself in his own family. Because if he can't control his own family, how is he to control the household of faith? It's a big responsibility. And Paul is saying, Titus, a man who is appointed pastor must demonstrate his spiritual leadership in the home. He leads his family in these truths. He holds them valuable, because this is what he'll be doing in leading the church, presenting the same values. Can this man lead by example? Does this man live out his convictions? Are his family proof of a godly life? Now let me say this. As a father, I am not qualified then to be the pastor of a church if my family is gone wild and in rebellion. Should I seek to be in that position? And the answer is no, sadly. As one old-time commentator says, when a man stands in the pulpit, he said, this is how to live. This is how to conduct yourself. This is God's high standard. This is what God expects of you. This is how you're to raise your children. This is how you pass godliness from one generation to the next. You look at his life and you say, wait a minute, just hang on a minute. You've got wild and uncontrolled children who live in rebellion and reject the gospel. Why are you the person who's telling me how to do this? So if I'm saying one thing and doing the opposite or letting it happen, what happens to that message? People don't want to listen. They say, you hypocrite. You say this is how you're supposed to live, this is how you're supposed to raise your children, and you're letting the opposite happen. So it questions the integrity of the message that is brought. Notice the pastor is to have children who believe, and they are faithful to what they believe. Now what does that mean? My children cannot live off my faith. My children cannot live off my wife's faith. They have to make it their own. They have to make it their own faith. They have to have their own convictions of what they believe. Because it's when they have those convictions, they put them into practice. So rather than rebel and go against what they believe, they must have their own faith. They must have their own living it out. As parents, we can't make them do it. Now look at the words. They are not accused of disposition or rebellion. Disposition means, in the original, drunkenness, wild revelry, and pagan festivals. It means being wild and wasteful. It means being indulgent. It means doing whatever you want without thinking about the consequences of your actions. It simply means doing your own thing. Now that would cover most of our modern day teenage, young adult lives, wouldn't it? And that's what it says. That's what rebellion is involved in. Rebellion is being out of control. It's being wild. It's doing whatever you want, whenever they want. And so what our text is saying, if a pastor allows his children to grow up wild and indulgent without control and discipline, even though they may claim to be Christian, then he's not qualified to be a pastor. If a pastor cannot control and lead his family in godliness, then he cannot expect to lead a church to follow his example because he hasn't done it himself. As a pastor, it's speaking of children who are under my roof. Now, I've got adult children. They're under my authority while ever they're living at home. And so they're under my control while ever they're living here. But you know, adult children don't always stay home. They move out and they find their own wives and they get married and they have their own responsibility. And so they're no longer under my authority or control. They have gotten their own children who they are responsible for. So it's not saying that, my adult children, whatever they do when they've grown up and moved out of home and got married, that I'm responsible for. They're responsible for their own decisions and their own families. But whatever they're under my roof, they're under my authority. And I'm responsible for their behavior. I'm responsible for setting the discipline and what is required in the home. And that's important. The qualifications and expectations are high. And so, the man who represents God and teaches the way that people are to follow the Lord, they also are high. And they should never, ever be lowered simply because of convenience. And guess what? We've got to stop there. There's so much more. But all I'm saying is these qualifications are set in Scripture by God. And they're set high for any person, any man who wants to be a pastor. It's not just, oh, I'll take him, I'll take them, take this man, he looks good. It's, let's have a look at the qualifications.